Hi everyone, this is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here tonight to film a sort of August wrap-up. And I know this is a little bit late. It's already the 11th of September. I can't believe it. But the 1st of September has just totally gotten away from me with work-related and family-related things going on. So I finally had a moment tonight to sit down and talk about some of the books that I read in August. I am not going to go through each and every book that I did read. I'm just going to pick out a few that I really would like to talk about because I read a total of 16 books in August. And many of them I've already discussed in previous videos over the last several weeks. And so I don't feel the need to really talk about them anymore. And I want to make sure that I spend time talking about the books that I hadn't talked about as much on the channel. So let's just get to it, because even with cutting out a whole bunch of books, there's still a lot of books I want to talk about. And the very first one is an audiobook that I listened to, and it's When Dimple Met Rishi by Sandhya Menon. I'm not really sure how to pronounce that, so I'm sorry. This book has been all over the place. This is a YA contemporary romance type of a deal. Dimple is the young woman here on the cover. She is graduated from high school, about to head off to college. It's the summer before she heads to college, and she is going off to a camp for programming, and she's super excited because that's what she's into, that's her thing. And so she convinces her parents basically to let her go to this thing. Unbeknownst to her, her parents have been talking with friends of theirs from India, and these friends have a son named Rishi, and he is also going to go to this programming camp, and he knows that their parents have arranged for them basically to have an arranged marriage. And Dimple doesn't know anything about that, nor does she care to have anything to do with it. It's a very fun and funny book. It was a good summer read, a light listen on audiobook. It wasn't super annoying as some YA romances can be. Rishi is really a sweetheart of a guy, super nice, and Dimple is a modern young woman who has a career path and is not particularly interested in boyfriends. So it's really fun to see them develop a relationship over the course of the book. And, you know, it's a romance, so you can guess how it ends, but it was super fun and I enjoyed it. The next book that I want to just mention that I read, let me see if I can bring up a picture of it right here. I read this one on ebook. It's called Shunned: How I Lost My Religion and Found Myself by Linda Curtis. This book, Linda Curtis was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. She was very serious about her faith. She married very young to another practicing Jehovah's Witness and was faithfully following the tenets of that religion when at some point in her 20s begins to question the whole concept and the whole process that Jehovah's Witnesses undergo, and makes the decision to get a divorce from her husband and leave the religion, and in doing so is shunned by the rest of her family and the rest of the people that she knew that were also Jehovah's Witnesses, because that's how Jehovah's Witnesses deal with people who leave the faith, is they just basically pretend like they're dead. So it was all about her process of leaving that faith and starting, you know, basically discovering herself, having a life outside of the religion. It was interesting. I had read the book because I wanted to learn more about Jehovah's Witnesses, but I did not particularly care for Linda Curtis's voice in this book. I thought the book was written very simplistically. She was kind of annoying at times, and a little bit, she came across as quite selfish at times, even though I totally understood where she was coming from and agreed with her that the tenets of the Jehovah faith were just ridiculous. She still came across as selfish at certain times, so it made it hard for me to relate to her and to sympathize with her. And in fact, I thought that Shunned was the worst book that I read in the month of August. I then would like to mention a book that I read during the POC-a-thon, and that is a science fiction book, Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, and this was a 5-star read for me. I really like Octavia Butler's writing. She is considered a classic author of sci-fi for a good reason, and Parable of the Sower is probably my favorite book of hers that I've read so far. I think that Parable of the Sower even tops, for me, Kindred, which I very much enjoyed. Parable of the Sower is a dystopian novel that's set in, I believe the novel, it was written back in the 70s or early 80s, but the time period of the book is like 2025, so near future. And in the near future, the gap has widened between the very wealthy and the not wealthy, and people who are sort of middle class live in these gated communities with the extremely poor on the outside, and the people that live within the gated communities are just trying to keep the poor and downtrodden out of their space and trying to be safe, because the people who have nothing basically are constantly like trying to break into these enclaves and take supplies and food and all that sort of thing, and there's violence, and nobody wants to be left on the outside of these communities. And then of course the very, very wealthy, the corporations run everything, and we're headed back to a time of indentured servitude or slavery or being owned by the company in a certain way. And the main character is a young woman of color. She's a teenager, and that's the nice thing about Octavia Butler's books, is many of the characters are people of color, but that's not their purpose. Their purpose is not to be in the story to be the token person of color. It's just a story about people of color. It just happens to be part of the narrative to have these people in it, and I find that extremely refreshing and really awesome. And the main character in this book, I don't remember her name, but she was a teenager of color, and she is sort of developing an idea in her mind of what she thinks society could be like in the future, that what humankind is meant to do is to leave earthly concerns and go into space and start over, basically. And she sort of is developing almost a religion of sorts based on some of her thinking and philosophy on this idea. And she gathers people to her who she convinces that basically her ideas make sense, and they begin a journey away from one of these walled communities. And I don't really want to, I probably have given too much away already, but I just found the whole concept fascinating. I found her as a character very compelling. And I believe that there is at least one more book related to this world and these characters, and I'm definitely going to be checking that out. I then listened to Born to Run, the biography written by Bruce Springsteen. I listened to it on audio. It's read by Bruce Springsteen, and it's quite a long book. It was quite a long audio book. I can't remember how many hours it was, but it was chunky. It was significant. It was a significant length book, but I found it really fascinating. It does detail in great depth his childhood, all the way, Bruce Springsteen's life, all the way from his childhood all the way up to basically I think just a few years ago, 2015, I believe. And he really tells us everything about his life from his very young childhood, where he was the pampered son of the family, even though they were very poor, all the way up to current, wealthy superstar, rock star. And it was fascinating. Like, he talks a lot about how he wrote, or how he got his ideas for his songs and his music. He talks about how he breaks into the music industry. He talks about all the different musicians that he played with over the course of time. and he doesn't pull any punches and about some of the relationships that he had that turned rocky through the years. But he doesn't let himself off the hook. He does not play the blame game. He does not say, oh, it was that person's fault because their personality was like this. You know, he lays faults out on both sides, but he's very gracious to the other people that he performed with and associated with as he rose up through the music ranks. I thought it was an excellent audiobook. I really enjoyed it, and if you are at all interested in music or rock and roll or Bruce Springsteen, I would highly, highly recommend that audiobook. So another collection that I finished was the Best American Essays 2017, which was edited by Leslie Jamison. I've talked about these Best American series ad nauseum on this channel. This collection of essays was not my favorite, was certainly not the best one of these Best American essay collections that I've read over the years. But like any essay collection, there were some that were really great and there were some that were not so great. There's some in here that take on, you know, usually what I like about these is it takes on different topics, especially social issues, in an engaging way. So you learn a lot about multiple topics, so it isn't all just about one thing. You know, in here, there's stuff about race, there's stuff about smoking, like cigarette smoking, there's stuff about, you know, flyover country, as it's called in the United States, sort of the Midwest red state political phenomenon. There's stuff about the AIDS crisis. So there's, you know, topics of all sorts in here. Some essays more successful than others, but still overall would very much recommend any of the Best American series. And sometime in the mid to the end of the month of August, I read The Inconvenient Indian, A Curious Account of Native People in North America by Thomas King. I buddy read this with Doris over at Aldi Books. This nonfiction is written by an indigenous person. I believe he's from Canadian indigenous tribe. I don't remember which one. But he talks equally about Canadian and American policies as they relate to indigenous peoples in North America. This was excellent. Thomas King has a very wry and sarcastic writing style, which I very much enjoyed, especially for a topic as heavy as this, because let me tell you, this book gets real depressing at times, because I mean white European people, treated the indigenous peoples of North America extremely shitty throughout the course of history. I mean, real bad. And Thomas King lays it all out there. One little factoid that I didn't know, and perhaps you did, but was how Mount Rushmore, the mountain out in the Dakotas that was carved in the likenesses of 4 U.S. presidents, was basically stolen from one of the tribes, which, you know, the treaty had said these Black Hills in, I can't remember if it was North or South Dakota, were given to this particular tribe, and then the U.S. government came along and took them and carved some U.S. presidents on their mountains, and still have not given them back to this tribe. The tribe has never relinquished their claim on the land. The U.S. government's tried to buy them out and pay them off, and the tribe refuses to accept the money, which is millions of dollars, and hundreds of millions of dollars, as a matter of fact. And they absolutely refuse to accept the money because they want the land. The land is theirs. It is part of their culture and their heritage. And that's just like one small snippet of the kind of information that's in this book. And Thomas King writes in a very engaging style about a very difficult topic. I first heard about this book from Mercedes over on Mercy's Bookish Musings, and she was not wrong, per usual. Great book. You should check it out if you're interested in the topic. Another audiobook that I listened to in the month of August was The Kiss Quotient, and I didn't write down the woman's name who wrote it, so I will put it down here. But another contemporary romance, this time an adult, about a woman who is on the autism spectrum and is a some kind of economist who falls in who is getting pressured to have a relationship and get married by her mother, and so she hires a escort to teach her how to have sex. And so you can see where this is all headed. It is a romance novel. It was cute, but I did not find it to be particularly believable, or it's been getting a lot of buzz as an excellent romance, and I did not find it to be as good as I expected it to be. It was all right. It was fun. It was fine. It was pleasant. The sex is quite raunchy, so if that's something that bothers you, probably give it a pass. But it was okay. I then also read, because of the POC-a-thon, I didn't get to it during that week, but Patrice Jones and I had decided to read it together. So we picked it up after the POC-a-thon. This is a classic of African literature written by Chinua Achebe. And it is not, it's easy to read in that the language is perfectly accessible. There's no difficulty there, but it was difficult to read in that the culture that's being described, and this is like a village in West Africa, during when colonial powers are starting to encroach into Africa and take over. And they are still, at the beginning of the novel, living independently from colonial powers, but it's starting, that process is happening. And so during that time period, it's a very patriarchal society. The women don't have any power. The children, don't have any. It's not an easy life, let's just say that. And we're following Okonkwo, is the main character. He is the head of his family. He has 3 wives and a bunch of children by each of them. And he is not a particularly nice person. You can see why he's not, because you find out about his childhood and how he was raised, but he is not very nice to his wives nor his children, and terrible things happen throughout this book. It was fascinating as a glimpse into another culture, but it was difficult to read in terms of sort of things that were done to children and to women. As colonial powers start to come into the area, first it's a Christian church that gets set up and starts to convert some of the native peoples to that religion versus their own traditional religious practices, and you start to see the pull between the two cultures. All very fascinating, but not easy to read about. It does give you a lot of food for thought. I would love to read something, and I think something that I have read that gives you a similar vibe, but from a more modern perspective, is Purple Hibiscus from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And I believe, to me, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie I liked that book a lot more. I engaged with it a lot more. I think her writing is amazing and better than this. But this is taking on similar themes from an earlier time period and from a male perspective, is what I would say. Definitely worth the read for the historical background, but pretty tough as well. Just a brief mention again, I know I've talked about it a couple of times, but I read The Forest Unseen as a buddy read with Doris again at Aldi Books. And this is A Year's Watch in Nature, The Forest Unseen, A Year's Watch in Nature by David George Haskell. I believe I've talked about it before. This was the other 5-star read for me in August. Excellent nature writing where this man, David Haskell, observes a meter square area in a forest in Tennessee for an entire year through all months and all weather events, and just describes what he sees and relates it to the broader natural world, in sort of vignettes and episodes, and I absolutely loved it. The writing was beautiful and meditative, and if you are into beautiful nature writing, this should be right up your alley. The last thing I want to talk about is the audio that I listened to for Women in Translation readathon in the very last week of August, and that is The Vegetarian by Han Kang. I don't have a picture to show you because, like I said, I listened to it on audio and it was a library book, so it's already gone back into the ether. And it is, The Vegetarian's been well reviewed all over this platform and everywhere, basically, in the bookish internet, and it is dearly beloved, and I can see why it is. I found a lot about the book to ponder and chew on. It basically tells the story of a young woman in Korea who is married, is a young woman, she's married in her probably 20s or early 30s, and becomes a vegetarian. She has a bad dream one night and she decides that she should not eat meat, and she is very determined to stick by her newfound beliefs, and being vegetarian is not considered acceptable in her culture. Her husband does not know what to think about it, and it's sort of, the story takes off from there. The story is told in 3 different sections. The first section is narrated by her husband, the second section is narrated by her brother-in-law, and the third section is narrated by her sister. And it's all about, the themes of the novel are all about a woman's choice and ability to direct her own life, consent, mental illness, and how relationships in families play out amongst all of these things. I think I found the themes and the messages that the author was trying to portray were great, and I very much got what she was trying to say, and I thought that was powerful. But because you never hear the story from the main character's point of view, the woman who has become a vegetarian, you get little snippets from her here and there, but you never really get in her head. It's like you're looking at the book through glass, right? You're always a remove away from the people in the book. So I thought it was fascinating as a thought experiment and a chance to think about some of these broader issues, and especially from a different cultural perspective than I have, but I never felt connected to the book. And so it was fascinating, but not emotional for me. And because of the topics that were being addressed, especially as you get towards the end, and it's more and more about the mental illness part, I just didn't have that empathetic connection that you would have if you really had built up a tie with the characters. So I thought that was weird. It was kind of weird to have that emotional distance with such a heartrending topic being discussed. And the middle section, which sort of got into the brother-in-law's obsession with this woman, his sexual obsession with this woman, and his inability to basically see her as a person. To him, all she was the sexual object. That whole thing was super fascinating. It was gross, and he was disgusting, but it was fascinating as a sort of a, shining that lens on sexual obsession and how women are objectified and not allowed to be anything other than a sexual object. Super fascinating. But for all of that, I can't say that I liked that book. So there you go. That's my thoughts about The Vegetarian. Take them or leave them. And this video is super long, way longer than I wanted it to be, and I apologize for that. But that is what I read in August that I hadn't really talked about in depth beforehand. I hope that you are all doing well and reading lots of great books, and I will talk to you later.